Okay, today it's 3.1 and we're doing a second day on lesson 3.1. So even though on my Schoology site, it didn't say there was 2 days on 3.1, we decided to spend an extra day on lesson 3.1. So this is a review of yesterday where we are figuring out domains. So the domain for add, subtract, or multiply, these red ones right here, all those have a domain that's made up of their two parents. The parent domain here is from F, that's this domain of F, and it was given to us right there. This is the domain of G, and we had to figure that one out because we started with this function and we set it greater than or equal to 0, and it ended up telling us that. So those are the two parent domains. And to find the domain of F plus G or F minus G or F times G, all I have to do then is to see where these two overlap each other. And they overlap from 0 to infinity. That's where they intersect. Some people like to write this way. If this is domain of F and this is domain of G, what I just did there was the domain of F intersected with the domain of G. And I think the number lines really help you to be able to see it. Okay, now if we were going to do F of X divided by G of X, that adds one extra complication. We still keep the same starters, but this third number line is the domain where G cannot equal 0. Notice, all I care about is what makes this function 0. And right here, I already solved for it. -5/2 is the thing that would make it equal 0. But before we said it could be equal to that. Why? Because up here, it was all right if the function was 0. But now that the function's down in the denominator, now you can't have it be 0 there. And therefore, if I had -5/2, I couldn't let it be that because otherwise I'd have a 0 in my denominator and it would crash this new baby function f of x over g of x. So now it's an empty spot there and it's filled in everywhere else because all this number line is about is what would make g be 0, and I can't let that happen. Now I need to overlap them, and does it really change anything? No, in this case it doesn't. All right. So, what's the new stuff for today? The new stuff for today is if we take two functions and we put a function inside of another function, then we need to be able to find the domain of that. All right, so why don't we just, to clean it up, everybody get to a new page, we'll make two new functions. F of x is going to be 7x plus 1, where x has to be less than or equal to 0. And g of x is going to be the square root of 9x plus 2. The first thing that I would do if I were you is figure out the domain of f, that's an easy one, and the domain of g, that's a little harder. Figure out the two domains of the parents. Then we'll figure out what to do when we end up putting f of g of x. We put the one function in the other function. First, just find the two domains for me of the parent functions. Okay, this one was just given to us. Set it right there. X is less than or equal to 0. That is an artificial domain. This normally doesn't have a problem with negative numbers or positive numbers. It doesn't ever crash. All reals is this normal domain, but we set an artificial domain of that. So you can just take its word for it and say, well, I guess the domain must be, you want it to be less than or equal to 0. Okay, domain of g. That comes from this, 9x plus 2 greater than or equal to 0. 9x plus, greater than, 9x greater than or equal to 0, and x greater than or equal to 0. Something went wrong there. Sorry. I'm going to try that one more time. 9x greater than or equal to negative 2. There we go. X greater than or equal to negative 2/9. There we go. That makes more sense. Okay, raise your hand if you had the same thing as I did. Okay, good. Now, if I have two domains here, for this, it would be wonderful if it was as easy as just overlap the two parent domains. But when you put one function inside of another function, it's much more complicated than that. First of all, let's figure out if you understand what this means. A lot of times this will be written, and you have to recognize this, f(o)g of x. That's the same thing as f, and think of like there's a little f here, of g of x. F of g of x is supposed to be interpreted this way. Whatever's function is second is the function that is on the inside. I like to think of this as an alligator that just ate a big meal. Oh, teeth don't go that way. Now it's going to be like a bent over reindeer for a second there. Okay, so here's his mouth. And he's got his little legs and his big long tail. And he ate something. As I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of things found inside an alligator. It's a great thing to Google sometime. There is all kinds of things, like license plates, like humans, like just crazy stuff. Sometimes huge things like deer, like a whole deer. They just eat crazy stuff. Well, this is like the f function ate the g of x function. So what I would do is take the f function and give it a big stomach. That's where its stomach is. You rewrite the f function, except with a big empty spot, where you can drop in the g function that it's going to eat. All right, the g function's right here. So I'm going to drop that in here. That is f of g of x. The f function, the blue one, ate the green function, the g. That's this. Okay, so now if you're trying to figure out the domain of this, this kind is definitely more complicated. But if you can memorize this formula, it will save the day. This is hard enough that even math teachers end up going over it before we teach it again because it's not easy to like picture in your head. You would imagine, of course, that one of these parent functions obviously matters. In fact, both of them eventually matter. Okay, but it's hard to like think through exactly what would work. Would you agree that if you stick something in, the first thing that has to do is it can't crash the g function, right? So that's the simplest thing. The one that's on the inside is involved. The domain of the inside one is intersected with something. But it's not as simple as just the domain of the f function. A lot of people think it is, and then they get it wrong. It's the domain of the inside, which in this case is the g function, intersected with the domain of, and now this part is where hopefully you can remember this because it's a little bit crazy. The domain of g in f. Now if you just look at it like this for a second, the domain of g intersected with the domain of g obviously doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't ever start that way, right? Because it's the same thing intersected with itself. So all you have to remember is that you start with the inside one, then you repeat the inside one, and then you have to say in f. Now what does that mean? We'll explain that in a second. So domain of the inside one intersected with the domain of the inside one in the other function. Okay, so one thing at a time. Domain of g, we already had that. We just have to look it up. And here's domain of g. I have it. It's right there. And it is x is greater than or equal to negative 2/9. So here's negative 2/9 greater than or equal to that. Now I got to do this weird G in F thing. What is the G function? It's right there. The G function is square root of 9x plus 2. This part is not just a number line. It forces you to do a little calculation off to the side. G in F means G, which is square root of 9x plus 2, in the domain of F, which is that x has to be less than or equal to 0. This has to be less than or equal to 0. Do you see any problem? Aren't most things going to come out of a square root as greater than 0? Is there any way to make this thing true? Just think carefully now. Is there any way to make it true? Yeah, there's only one thing that would make it true. It's the thing that makes it equal 0, right? So really, we now have a new equation. I'm solving this, and I just really got to figure out where is 9x, square root of 9x plus 2 equal to 0. And that's not that hard. I just got to find where x turns out to be negative. Oh, it's that same number we had before. What is it? Negative 2/9. And again, this is negative 2/9 is the only thing that works in this function. X has to be negative 2/9 equals negative 2/9 because that's the only thing that will make it equal 0. So then here's that other thing I'm supposed to overlap it with, the domain of G in F, and that is just negative 2/9. And where do they overlap? Only at negative 2/9. Right there at that spot is the only place that would work. I know what I just did there was a little intense. I'm going to back up to the most important part. The domain of G in F. Okay, I was right here. And I think there's a better way I could show you. G needs to go into the F domain. G in the domain of F. So here's the domain of F right here. Let's start with writing that this time. X is less than or equal to 0. X is less than or equal to 0. And I'm supposed to put G in that. Do you get how there's only one place to put the G then? It's got to go right here. So what's G? The G function is right there. Square root of 9x plus 2.
7.
And now, teacher, don't worry, otherwise I'd be all over them. Okay, so then from here, I knew that nothing coming out of a square root would be less than 0. So I could just solve it and say, I want the square root of 9x plus 2 to be equal to 0. And then there was only one thing that did that. X had to be negative 2/9. And so once I knew that that was my other domain, I go down here and I say, here's negative 2/9. And I say it has to be that. And then the only place they overlap is on that one little spot. All right. Now, you'll really only understand this if you do one by yourself here. So I'm going to give you a new one. And imagine for a moment we've got these two functions. In fact, let's do one of our, no, I'm going to make a new one. F of x, 3x plus 3x plus 10, where x is less than or equal to 0. G of x is going to be square root of x plus 7. I'd like you to figure out what is f over g of x. No, I'm wrong. Not divide. FOG. Sorry. FOG of x. Figure out what that is, and then figure out what the domain of that is. That's going to be the hard part where you have to overlap two number lines, and it's not just f and g. I'll pause for a second while I give that a shot. In case it helps you, you should be doing f of g of x. The f function swallowed the g function. Okay, I'm going to get started. So, f is this, 3 empty spot plus 10. You always start with what you're going to put the other thing into. Now I'm going to put something in there. I'm going to put in g. G of x is right here, and it goes in there. And that's square root of x plus 7. That's f of g of x. Any questions on that? How many got that part right? Okay, good. Next part. This is domain of the which one? Which one, the inside or outside? Inside. And which one is on the inside? Domain of g. Okay. So I go and look at the domain of g. Oh, I never figured out the domain of g. Maybe I should do that. Domain of g is given by x plus 7 greater than 0. So x, or equal to 0, sorry. X subtract 7 greater than or equal to negative 7. So here's a negative 7. It's greater than or equal to that. With me so far? Okay. Any questions on that part? Now, here's the tricky part. The domain of g in the domain of f. So, the domain of g in the domain of f. Here's the domain of g. Sorry, wait a minute. Domain of f is the one I want. I want the domain of f, and I'm going to stick g into it. The domain of f is right here. So I'm doing a little algebra work to figure this out. I have to say x has to be less than or equal to 0. And now I'm supposed to put g in that. G is this square root of x plus 7. And where would I put it in? Right there. So square root of x plus 7 is right there. And then you know you can't make it less than 0. So you just worry about what makes it equal 0, because square roots can't be negative. So I got to say x would be negative 7 is the only thing that works. So here's negative 7. Only thing that works. Final answer, where do they overlap? Right there. So what is the domain? How would you write that? From negative 7 to negative 7? Brackets? Do you see anything wrong with that? Actually, a lot of times people will have a parenthesis around them. And that's even okay, because we know that even though it normally means you can't touch that, if you're just putting something in parentheses, that's the only thing. And yes, that's an MC Hammer classic. Can't touch this too. So if you just wrote it like that, that's okay too. Negative 7 is the domain. I would prefer brackets because it makes more sense to me. Negative 7 works. Okay. So that's how to find the domain of a function that's been put in another function. And that is as complicated as this chapter gets. From here on out, it won't be that bad. Yes? Yes. All right. So let me explain what the assignment is for today then. So get down to where the assignment is. Okay, this is where we started yesterday. And you were able to do all of those, including the domain. The domain is the hard part, but this is the only one that had 3 number lines. Okay, so you've already done that. This one I had you skip. Now I need you to go back and do it. Extra practice on that kind. By the way, what is the domain of f here? All reals, because you can't crash it. You can't fix it. There's no square root to crash, and there's no denominator to crash. What's the domain of that? All reals also. So this is a pretty easy one. The only thing you have to worry about then is your divide, because that's got 3 number lines. All reals, and then you got it. The third one is what crashes G. So I'll let you figure that one out. This one, I had you do one of them and not do the other. So you've already done 18. Now you got to just add to it number 19. Then this we already did. We did a practice of it at the beginning of the hour. This one is still going to be a skip for you. It's not really that hard. It looks really complicated. It's really not, but I'll tell you more about those later. And the last thing is this, which is f plus g of -3. Do you get that's the exact same thing as f of x plus g of x, except they told you what x is? This means f of x plus g of x, right? But what did they tell you x was? So then it's really f of -3 and g of -3. You might want to write that down. Now I'm not done yet, but that's what I'm supposed to do. So then what is f of -3? That's this part right there. F of -3 is what? 4. And g of -3 was found right here is what? So this one's 4, and this one's -2, and it's 4 plus -2. Final answer? 4 plus -2. Come on. +2. There we go. So you've got to go through each one, and what does it mean? This means that x is 2, and I want the f of x divided by the g of x. So I really want f of 2 divided by g of 2. And f of 2 can be found up here. Here's f of 2. And it's 4, and g of 2, etc. I think you can handle it from there. So you're still skipping this, but you're doing everything else. All right, skipping this. This is the one we skip. It's the purple, or no, that's not purple. Orange, the orange page, the whole page. You're not doing that page. Okay, but everything else you're doing. I don't want to go over what I've said it several times now. Not. That's the one thing you're not doing. Okay. So now, this is the lesson actually for tomorrow, but now we need to grade the Mad Mouse, and that's all I have for the video for today.